And now we're actually going to spend more time on our cerebral cortex, because I couldn't just gloss over what I talked about as one of the most important parts of the human brain, of what makes humans special in a lot of researchers' eyes. Our cerebral cortex is how we think and process information. Of course, we're going to spend some more time on it. And so there are a couple of different ways that you can divide up the cerebral cortex. And we're going to look at sort of our different lobes. So we have our frontal lobe, which is towards the front of our head. So this is where our eyes would be. This is the back of our head. That's our cerebellum again. So this is where our neck meets the back of our skull. Just above the cerebellum, we have our occipital lobe. And then at our temples, just above our ear, I guess entirely behind our ears, is where the temporal lobe is. And then our parietal lobe spans across sort of the upper back part above the occipital lobe, but still towards the back. And so we can look at a slightly different diagram that still has our occipital lobe, our temporal lobe, our parietal lobe, and our frontal lobe, but this is also including some extra information that's really important. So we can look here, we have indicated Broca's area, and this is really important for speech formation. So Broca's area is involved in parts of spoken and written language. So this part of the brain is specialized for language. So it's going to look at the production of sentences, and that's where we do sort of our grammar and syntax stuff. So if you have damage to Broca's area, then you would be unable to form coherent speech. And because it's kind of all types of language, you'd also have trouble, say, writing something down. So I always refer trouble with words today. I always refer people to, there's an episode of House where there's a man with damage to his Broca's area, and whenever he tries to think of a word to get a point across, he's reaching for the correct word and something isn't quite working. So he's not able to form coherent sentences. So if you are a House fan, maybe you remember that episode, and that's a kind of neat example of problems with Broca's area. We have the pair to Broca's area, which is Wernicke's area. So instead of speech formation or production, which is Broca's area, Wernicke's area is all about understanding speech. So this is the part of our brain that's specialized for us being able to comprehend the things that we're hearing. So if somebody has damage to their Wernicke's area, they could still produce coherent language. They could tell you something, but they wouldn't be able to understand your response to them. They wouldn't be able to have a conversation because they can't understand language. And these two areas are usually located in the left hemisphere. And that's because in most people, the left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere. There are special cases where some people will have them on the right side, in the right hemisphere. And things like that. This is just an FYI because, again, I think it's really cool. If you're ever asked to participate in a brain imaging study, one of the first questions that they'll ask you is if you're left-handed. And unfortunately, if you're left-handed, they'll exclude you from a lot of brain studies, or they'll put you in your own special group because most people who are right-hand dominant, their brains follow most of the normal patterns, so their left hemisphere is usually dominant. But people who are left-handed, their brains might be in the dominant configuration, but there's a pretty good chance that they'll be opposite. So people who are left-handed are more likely to have these two areas on the right side of the brain. but it's not guaranteed. And that maybe it's here, maybe it's there, is why a lot of left-handed people get excluded from brain imaging studies. So back to other areas. We can talk about, so here we have our primary motor cortex. That's this blue strip here. So this is still part of the frontal lobe. And this is going to be our motor cortex. It's involved in our voluntary or motor movement. So when we decide to move our hands or our feet, when we make a choice to make a movement, it's being routed through this motor cortex. And then similarly, we have a somatic sensory cortex. And this is sometimes called a somatosensory, squishing the two words together, a somatosensory cortex. Both are apparently correct. So don't be weirded out if you see them. I was kind of put off because our textbook uses somatic sensory cortex, but I was taught somatosensory cortex from an anatomy course. But both are acceptable. And this sensory cortex, as you might imagine, is responsible for our incoming sensory information. So this part of the brain is where our, scroll back and make sure I get it right. That's where our thalamus is going to be sending that sensory information, is here to this somatic sensory cortex. So we will get to this in just another slide, but we'll talk about it in more detail on another slide. We would have our thalamus. It's going to send a signal up to our somatic sensory cortex. So that's our sensory nerves sending information in. We can then make a decision regarding that information incoming, and our motor cortex can decide to respond and send a signal back down out through the brainstem to have our motor neurons act on that action. So this is one of the pathways that we're going to talk about, where sensory information comes in, goes through the sensory cortex. We make a decision to use a motor action in response. That's going to go through the motor cortex, and that sends commands out to our motor neurons so that we can actually do those actions. All right, that's enough waffling on this one image here. We can talk about the specifics. So we've already said our motor cortex is controlling the muscles involved in our voluntary body movements. And we're focusing on them being voluntary because you're choosing to move those muscles. Our somatic sensory cortex is receiving input. Those are the sensations that we're getting from receptors throughout our body. We get sensations of heat and touch and cold, all of our senses of balance and orientation. Those are all going to send a signal to our somatic sensory cortex so that we know what we're experiencing. And we can have communication between these two cortices, which is what this image is for. And we have this really interesting setup where, because this sensory input and the motor output are located right up against each other, they're able to talk very quickly. And the parts that they correspond to also line up. So if we look at sort of starting on the outside here for our motor cortex, if you're deciding to do something with your tongue or your jaw or parts of your face, that's going to be towards the outside, towards the bottom here of this cortex. And if you are acting on some kind of sensory information, we can hop over here and we'll see that our tongue and our face are all located pretty much in that same area. So there's this connection across where, so this would be the tongue motor response, and this would be our tongue sensory input. They're right next to each other. And so in that relay of information coming up through the brainstem, and it would go to this part of the somatic sensory cortex, and it can just hop directly across to the equivalent part of the motor cortex so that we can respond. And that proximity, that close togetherness, allows us to respond very quickly to incoming sensory information. So even if we don't get the added boost, the added speed of a reflex response where our spinal cord controls the response, we can still have a relatively short responding time because the signals don't have to travel very far within the brain once they've arrived here. And that's pretty cool that they line up fairly closely. We can also talk very, very briefly about our primary auditory cortex and our primary visual cortex. So you might imagine that our primary auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe because that's where we were kind of already talking about speech and recognition and things like that. Instead of, say, Wernicke's area being only located on the left side of the brain, though, our primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe on both sides. So we're not having processing on just the right side or the left side. It's going to be in both hemispheres. So it isn't split up and specialized in this case. And our primary visual cortex, we're just going to have sort of one broad visual cortex, and that's going to be our occipital lobe at the back of our head. So just above our cerebellum. And so this is another image showing our Wernicke's and Broca's area. So Wernicke's is that incoming interpretation of speech. So this would be getting a signal from our ears where we're having that auditory receptor, that sensory information coming in, and it would get routed to Wernicke's area because it's speech. Once Wernicke's area is has processed it, we could have some routing here through our Broca's area if you were going to respond. And if you're going to be activating Broca's area to respond to some kind of thing you've heard, you're also going to then activate the motor cortex that makes your mouth do the movements that you need to make the sounds your Broca's area has formulated. So this is sort of a 3-step process where you have that incoming, you decide what you're going to say in response, and you have to go through the motor cortex to formulate your response. Our next cortex that we're going to talk about isn't so much a specific location, but a more abstract concept. And this is the association cortex. And it's not really one cortex. We could talk about association cortices being plural. And this is sort of localized throughout all lobes of our cerebral cortex. So an association cortex is basically a cluster of neurons, our interneurons, that are going to let us do some higher level functions and interconnected functions. So these are the parts of the brain that seem to allow us to have perception, thought, language. If it's not just, we can use the example again of hearing a song. So you're perceiving it, you're hearing it through your ears, but then you have to remember, well, have I heard this song before? Let's find a memory. Does it match with anything? And then once you've understood that, yeah, I've heard this song before, who's it by? What song is it? All of that information gets shoved together in an association cortex. And this isn't stuck in one particular part of the brain. It could be all over the brain as it's collecting information from all of the other places that you've stored memories or experiences. And so these association cortices are very important for, again, stuff that makes us special as humans, where we have advanced perception and higher levels of thought, and we can produce language and so on and so forth. And one of the cool parts about these association cortices, above and beyond them allowing us to make these complex connections, these areas of the brain actually appear silent. So if you're using brain imaging and you're trying to figure out, is this association cortex active, it doesn't really show up. So it can still be allowing us to make connections, but we can't really pinpoint a particular area where this cortex would be. So they're not going to be showing up on our brain scans so that we can monitor them closely. So they're a little bit mysterious and hard to study for that reason. Hemispheric lateralization is going to come from the fact that our brain has two sides. So when we were looking at all of our different brain imaging techniques, we saw that, there we go, having some issues with my pen there. So we saw that the brain kind of had these two halves. Ooh, that is terrible, terrible crooked representation. But the brain has sort of two halves. So if this is the front of your head and this is the back of your head, you have these two sides of your brain. And so the front part would be your frontal lobe and the occipital lobe would be towards the back. And at the temples, you have your temporal lobe, and then the parietal lobe is sort of the rest in the middle there. But we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the fact that our brain has those two different sides. And those sides are called hemispheres. So we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And as you can imagine, the left hemisphere is on the left side of the brain, and the right hemisphere is on the right side of the brain. And these hemispheres are kind of self-contained. So we have, like I said, all of the different lobes of the brain are contained within one side of the brain, but they also communicate between the two sides. But they only connect at one particular place. And this is called the corpus callosum. So this bridge between the two hemispheres is actually made up of sort of a fibrous looking stretch that is a bunch of neurons running back and forth between the two hemispheres. And we can run into very special cases where sometimes a patient will have to have their corpus callosum severed. This is called a corpus callostomy because they are cutting that connection. So they sever this ability to communicate across the two hemispheres. And so this creates a very special case, resulting in split brain patients, which we'll come back to in just a minute. But what this basically means is that any information that comes to this side of the brain stays on this side of the brain, and any information that comes in over here can only be used over here. And we can't have any transfer of information from one side to the other. So this, in and of itself, having two hemispheres that are connected by our corpus callosum, isn't really hemispheric lateralization, but it does set us up for the existence of hemispheric lateralization. Now, hemispheric lateralization is just the idea that one hemisphere or one side of your brain is specialized for a particular task or set of tasks. And so some really good examples of lateralization that we should all be able to experience. The most common one is handedness. So most people are going to be either right or left-handed. And this handedness means that one side of our body is a lot more dexterous and more precise than the other. So for the majority of the population, they are right-handed. So their right side of the body is going to be a little bit more dexterous. That's how you can write and do fine motor tasks with your right hand. But your left hand is not so great at doing that. And interestingly, our right hand on... figured I was going to draw a hand. Well, it's not so bad. So our right hand is actually going to end up being controlled by the left side of our brain, not the right side. And our left hand, in turn, is controlled by the right side of the brain. And that's why in the last lecture, I mentioned that occasionally left-handed people, the dominant side of their brain is going to be the right side, and that side will contain their Broca's and Wernicke's area, just because it's specialized that way. But this handedness ends up showing up because one side of our brain, one hemisphere, is more specialized than the other. And less commonly, people also have footedness, which you don't necessarily notice unless you play a kicking sport. So if you played soccer, maybe you always kicked the ball with your right foot. And again, most of the time, footedness will match handedness, but not always. Another example is the case of ocular dominance. So I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but if you pick a point to look at, say on the other side of the room, maybe you're going to look at one corner of your room. If you look at it with both eyes, it's going to appear to be in one position. If you close one eye, that position, that corner, will either look like it stays in the same place, or it will look like it has moved. And so closing one eye will have it stay in the same place. Closing the other eye instead will have it look like it moves. And so the eye, where the corner doesn't look like it's moved, is going to be your dominant eye, hence ocular dominance. And that just means that when we're making an image of the world around us, our body tends to rely, or our brain tends to rely, a little bit more heavily on one side versus the other. So you might be right eye dominant or left eye dominant, depending. And we also have something very similar with our hearing, where we have oral dominance, where you can hear better on one side over the other. And for most people, this works out as one side is really good at hearing things in the range of, say, human speech. So you would notice someone calling your name on your, say, right-hand side, but the left-hand side would be a lot better at general background noise. So our hemispheres are specialized to either pick up on language or everything else. And so these differences in specialization are what we're looking at with this lateralization. So lateralization just being one side is good at something and the other side is good usually at something else. And so for our general rules, again, keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, and it especially doesn't always hold true for people who are left-handed, for the reasons we talked about last time. But for the most part, our right hemisphere, the right side of our brain, is going to be active in terms of our feelings, intuition, our sense of humor. It's going to be active for aesthetic and color, things that are sort of artistic. Our right hemisphere is also good for relationships between things, picking up on rhythms, physical senses, and motor skills. So actually doing activities and picking up on relationships between things. And like I said, our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. So we have this crossover of signals where the things coming from the right side of our body are processed in our left hemisphere. And then if we wanted to look at our left hemisphere is more analytical thinking. It's going to be where we process rules and logic, where we can look at structures and mathematics and planning ahead. And in most people, where we have speech and language centers, but also our perception of time. And the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. And this is why sometimes you'll see those BuzzFeed quizzes that ask, are you left or right-brained? And they're basically asking, are you more analytical and logical, or are you more artistic and free-spirited? But the truth is we all use both sides of our brain. They're just good at different tasks in different quantities. And now, for us to get back to the idea of split brain patients, because they are really cool cases to look at, before we can start talking about that, we need a little bit information on the specifics of visual lateralization. And so what's with our visual lateralization is that information incoming from our eyes is split up in a very particular manner. And so what this diagram here is showing us is that our left visual field, so the stuff that we see on the left side of our body, this blue here, is going to be processed in the right side of our brain. So even our left eye is going to send that information down across our corpus callosum to the right side of the brain, which would be our occipital lobe and our visual center. And our right eye, when it sees things on the left side, is just going to pass that information straight back. So when it's seeing left information using our right eye, it stays on the right side of the brain. There's no crossover there. And this will become important in just a moment. For our right visual fields, things on the right side of the body, if the left eye is seeing it, it stays on the left side. If the right eye is seeing something on the right side, that information gets sent across that corpus callosum over to the left side of the brain. So this is our normal setup where things that we see on the left side of our body are processed on the right side of the brain. Things on the right side are processed on the left. Same as things that we feel on the right side are processed on the left, and so on. But the part that gets really cool is if we have someone who has a corpus callostomy where we sever this link here, the only way that this right information, that's things that we see on the right side of our body, they can only be seen with our left eye and processed on the left side. This crossover doesn't exist anymore. So effectively, our right eye doesn't see or do anything with the information on the right side of our body. And similarly, because of this severing of the corpus callosum, things on the left side of the body can't be seen by the left eye because this crossing over doesn't happen anymore. So if something's on the left, you can only see it with your right eye, and it can only be processed on this side of your body. And so you can imagine, as psychologists interested in people who have had this corpus callostomy, we could play with this a little bit, where things that are seen with the right eye are only processed on the right side of the brain, and things that are seen with the left eye are only going to be processed on the left side of our brain. Well, the left side of our brain is where our language centers are. So if you see something with your left eye, maybe you could talk about it. You could have a conversation about it. But if you saw it with your right eye, there's no language center on the right side of the brain. So you can't verbalize the thing that you saw. And that is really, really cool. And so this is one of those concepts where it might be a little bit difficult to visualize specifically what I'm talking about. So I've actually included a video. So same as before, you can click on the link using your slides, or I have uploaded this video, a link to it, on our e-class just underneath where this lecture video is. Certain kinds of functioning could be affected if you have an injury to that area. And we're going to spend a specific couple of slides going over a couple more examples. So some of these might be stuff that I've already mentioned, but others are just going to be extra things that we might expect to see if there was damage to some of the areas of the brain that we've been talking about. And we're going to start with our cerebral cortex because that is such a large part of our brain. And a lot of people will have damage to their cerebral cortex if they end up hitting their head. The problem is our cerebral cortex is large and varied. So it really depends on which specific part of the cerebral cortex is damaged. So we're going to break those down into the different lobes. For our frontal lobe, that part at the front of our head, that's doing a lot of our connective stuff. It's also going to be involved in our ability to pick up on facial expressions. So our frontal lobe, if it's damaged, we might not be able to recognize if someone is happy versus angry. We might lose that ability to pick up on facial expressions. We might lose fine motor control. So maybe you're trembling because our frontal lobe is also including that primary motor cortex. So you might not be able to very precisely control your actions because you're having trouble sending signals to the motor neurons to tell the muscles to do something. And you might see changes in behavior, which is pretty broad, which could come from problems with motor control, or it could be related to something else. But these are our general issues that we'll talk about for the frontal lobe. For our parietal lobe, this includes our sensory cortex. So damage to our parietal lobe, overlapping with our sensory cortex, it could affect our perception of our senses. So we might not be able to tell our body position or our orientation. We might have issues with visual attention and integrating and dealing with that information. It could also cross over into our motor cortex because we use our sensory information coming in to decide what to do and respond with in the motor cortex. So problems here can cascade to the next door motor cortex and influence our motor movement as well. So lots of stuff that can go wrong there. For our temporal lobe, this is going to be the first area that our sort of visual and auditory incoming sensory stuff is processed. So we could have some issues with perception. Especially this would start influencing, say, visual information that's getting relayed backwards towards our occipital lobe, where our visual centers are. So this can start affecting visual and auditory recall. For our occipital lobe, at the very back of our heads, that's where our visual center is, so damage there can cause visual hallucinations or adjustments to our perceptions of color. So these kind of line up with what's going on in each of these lobes. If we want to focus on some other very important structures that we've studied damage in, we can look at damage to the thalamus. And because our thalamus is one of those relay type stations, and it seems to also be involved in some of our memory, we can end up with anterograde amnesia. So the inability to form new memories. And this will come up again in the memory chapter, but good to keep in mind for now. Again, as that relay and assigning different incoming information to the appropriate parts of the brain, damage at this relay station can impair our executive functions. We can have trouble deciding what to do with incoming information. If the damage is severe enough, we can have a coma, or less severe, loss of focus, the inability to decide what to attend to or pay attention to, which in turn can cause a decreased ability to perceive things. So if you're not paying attention to or focusing on things, you're not going to perceive much about those things. So these are all kind of related to each other. And again, these should all relate back to the function or the purpose that the thalamus serves. Lastly, our hypothalamus. This tends to be involved in, as we said before, our internal body regulation. So it's going to be maintaining our homeostatic balances, and it does a lot of that through the use of hormones. So if we damage our hypothalamus, we might have problems with our hormone production. We might release the wrong amount of hormones or release them at the wrong time. And this leads to potential dysregulation of our basic biological needs. Maybe you're overproducing a hormone that makes you burn fat. So you're going to be going through energy a lot faster. Maybe your body temperature gets higher because you're burning energy. So your homeostatic balance gets thrown off. And having incorrect balances of hormones can start influencing other parts, like your motivation or your activity. And those can be sort of overrepresented or overstimulated, or they could be understimulated. So again, the things that can go wrong are related to the function of the area that we're looking at.